friends, I'm Pastor Kelly, and I'm here with chapter 7 from We Make the Road by Walking by Brian McLaren, and we're continuing in the book of Genesis. Today's stories are pretty fun. If you haven't read the Bible passages yet, it's Genesis chapter 18, verses 9 to 33, and Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 through 14. If you're really ambitious, also read Micah 6, verses 6 through 8. All right. If you haven't read chapter 7 in the book yet, go ahead and do that too. These Bible passages in Genesis are some of the toughest passages in the whole Bible. But see, I didn't know that in seminary. I grew up learning all the parts of Genesis. The story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph. The stories in Exodus of Moses. And so I just assumed Abram's story was really similar to other people's story. Except here's the thing. Abraham is considered the father of the 3 major world religions. In Genesis, they're telling the story of how Judaism was founded after Abraham and his descendants, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob was renamed Israel and had 12 sons who became the 12 tribes of Israel. The story of Abraham really matters to Jewish people. Well, eventually that story really mattered to Christian people too, because Jesus was a Jewish person. So when we follow Jesus, we also read the Old Testament and read about Abraham. What some of you might not know is that Muslims also read this Bible passage. Muslims read our Old Testament as well, and they know that Abram was the founder of the Jewish people, and they know that he was a great prophet. Muslims also believe that Abraham's first son, Ishmael, was the father of the Arabic people, and thus the father of the Muslim world. Muslims believe that that's where Jewish and Muslim folks separated. Abram had a son named Isaac, and his descendants ended up being Jewish, and Abram also had a son named Ishmael, and his descendants ended up being Muslim. This was a huge revelation to me when I figured it out a couple years ago, and so now I share it with folks. The Abram story is one that we actually all have in common. But we all kind of understand this story in Genesis 18 and 22 a little differently. You see, back then, it was really common for gods to require human sacrifice. They didn't know how babies were made. They just assumed gods put them there, and then they were born. They also assumed that death was when gods took you away. It makes some sense. So if the gods demanded that you sacrifice a child, it was something that was really, really common 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. It made sense that the gods who gave life would also demand that life as sacrifice. So when God asked Abram to go up on a mountain and sacrifice his son Isaac, the Bible does not tell us that Abraham challenged God at all. Just like God had told Abraham in the last chapter to leave his country and walk to another country, that was a crazy thing, and Abram followed it. Actually sacrificing his son was pretty commonplace back then. The part that was radical in this story is not that Abraham thought he had to sacrifice his son, but that Abraham recognized God gave the gift of an animal instead. See, understanding that Yahweh God is different from all the other gods, that's what the Jewish religion was based on. That their God did not demand human sacrifice. Their God only demanded animal sacrifices. That God wanted to give life to everyone. In the New Testament, we find out that God doesn't even want animal sacrifices. God just wants our hearts. God wants us to act justly and love mercy and walk humbly with God. So what in your life is a big sacrifice that God might be asking of you? What's a time when you thought God was asking you to do something and it was so completely countercultural that it was hard to explain to anybody? For a lot of folks, it's hard to understand how I'm here in Wisconsin being a pastor of 2 different churches. It's so countercultural for a pastor to do that, people just don't get it. But for those of us who've been a part of the process, we know that God is working through this. What are some ways in your life when God asked you to make a sacrifice and then blessed you beyond your wildest imaginations? I can't wait to hear your stories.